Now, here are your hosts, Dominic Tavella and Michael Hart.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman. Today is Tuesday, November 7th, 2023, and Dominic is unavailable this evening, and we got David Walker, one of our advisors out in Denver, Colorado, to pinch hit for him again this evening. How are you, David?
Michael, the weather is here and we wish you were beautiful. That's how we greet you here at this time of year.
Well, thank you for that Denver reception, and you become our regular pinch hitter for Dominic. So thank you for that. And let's just jump into the market. You know, the market's been beautiful also. Dave, the S&P last week was up almost 6. The Dow Jones was up a little over 5. The NASDAQ was up 6.5. And we got another 2 days to build on top of that. So maybe, just maybe, good news is good news, and the market seems to be reacting to that.
Well, what am I going to do with my contrarian line of thought now that good news is good news, Mike? What should I be doing next? Believing in good news?
Well, you know what? You could choose to be Lucy or you could choose to be Charlie Brown, right? And the market more often than not has been Charlie Brown for the last 2 years.
Well,
and last Wednesday, when the Fed announced they weren't going to raise interest rates, then November, and I love how these prognosticators love to read between the lines of what Jerome Powell says, but the general consensus is that they're not going to raise interest rates in December, and maybe, just maybe, they're done, David. So if you're the contrarian, you believe we're not done. If you want to believe what Powell might be saying, you're Charlie Brown. So are you Charlie Brown or are you Lucy?
I'm going to go ahead and say that I resemble Charlie Brown more and more as I age, Michael, and leave it at that. But if you look at the chart, it is interesting because there was a little uptick there. I mean, we saw inflation down, and then all of a sudden there was a little uptick there, a little nudge to the positive again. And I just wonder how nervous that's going to make the Fed and what effect that might have. Maybe that was just an aberration. It's pretty hard to sustain anything for as long as they have. But then again, maybe they're not done yet if they're serious about the 2% figure.
Right. If they're and we were at a meeting with BlackRock a couple of weeks ago, and I was with Rick Reeder, who runs all of their fixed income, and he's really well connected. And I asked him that very question, and he said, "Look, yes, he's wedded to the 2% number, but he's not rigid. And if they get close enough and really feel that it's under control, he'll back off of that number particularly." But the problem, David, and the reason I refer to good news being good news for a change is 2 weeks ago when the GDP number came out, the gross domestic product number came out for the quarter grew at 5%, which is normally something to cheer about.
Yes, that's a big number.
It's a big number, right? How are we going to have a recession if the economy is growing at 5%?
Right.
But the Fed watchers said, if it's growing that quickly, then inflation's not under control, and the Fed is not done yet, which is why we had 2 more weeks of pain. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And is that a believable number, honestly? Or is that going to be adjusted as we go forward? The way so many numbers get adjusted, especially the employment numbers. I mean, it's hard to believe anything when those employment numbers come out. And even, with that 150-ish thousand number, as you look at that, you saw, okay, well, maybe at least a third, maybe more of that was government employment. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but that's not exactly robust, economic growth across the whole economy. It's a factor, but it's I don't know if it's really worth cheering yet.
Right. And the other thing that they watch very closely, whoever they are, is wage pressure, right? Like
yes,
wage
indeed.
Inflation.
Yes.
And while the job market's been stubbornly strong, and Dominic and I have talked about it all year, we've talked about it together on this show, the wage pressure is also another slight indicator that maybe, that the economy can avoid a recession and have this proverbial soft landing because wage pressure is easing up as well.
Right. Well, I have to admit, maybe this is the Charlie Brown in me, but maybe there are days when I just think, why don't we just get this recession over with by having one, have a mild one and get it over with and flush it and move on. To me, it's almost like that would be an answer. It would satisfy certain forces in the economy. What do you think about that?
I think if that happened, that would be a positive for the market,
Right.
right? Because most people don't remember, who even pay attention to this, that we had a recession in the beginning of the pandemic.
Yep.
Now, it may have lasted 10 minutes, but technically we fell into a recession. So we had a couple of quarters in a row, the government declared a recession, and we all know what happened in 2020 after people realized, holy moly, we're in this whole new brave world. The market really went through the stratosphere. And we had a recession right in the middle of it.
Yep. And I don't remember us predicting that necessarily, but it sure took off and it was a bit of a surprise. I think it's also interesting now, and maybe I'm wrong, but I perceive a certain sensitivity or relationship between any downtick at all in interest rates. There seems to be an immediate bounce up with the NASDAQ. And, there's a correlation there that's very strong, but it almost seems like it's being reflected quicker and more obviously now than it had been, maybe go back 6 months, 9 months, a year ago.
Yes, because I think now you're 100% right. That's a great observation. And I think because now investors, prognosticators are believing that we're getting towards the end of the interest rate cycle. And right. and therefore the NASDAQ, the tech sector, which normally does not do well in a rising rate environment, they should excel. And really, David, we haven't talked about it, but even the corporate earnings have not been terrible.
No, they haven't.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And some have been pretty good. So, I wonder also, maybe we should explain, what that relationship is in terms of why some of those smaller, leaner, more technology-oriented companies, their stocks do react so immediately to upticks in interest rates. Why is that?
Well, the reason that is because the cost of doing business when interest rates go down is obviously less expensive. So small, a company like Apple, which has a cajillion dollars, they can self-fund things. But smaller technology or bio companies or healthcare companies who need to build stuff and need to pay money for research, the cost of doing business goes down. So when the interest rate cycle goes in their favor, they're able to borrow money, it costs less, and they're able to get things to market quicker.
So the more leveraged they are, so to speak, the more debt perhaps they carry or will require or are perceived to need, then the more impact relative to interest rates.
Correct. And that's why every now and again, David, you hear this expression, zombie companies. And basically, these are companies that are still alive, but, don't know it. And they're basically either run out of money or about to run out of money, or they're going to be sold. But one way or another, their goose has been cooked.
Right. Now, there aren't too many of those out there, but there are a few.
Yes.
And so that implies that there may well be some further layoffs in some sectors of technology, at least some of those companies that are barely hanging on, if interest rates go up at all in the near future.
David, in the near term, if everyone's wrong and interest rates go up, the market's going to get back all these gains. As soon as just like you and I are sitting here, I could promise you, if they raise interest rates, the market will give this all back in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
So, look, let's switch gears. We're going to do a show tonight that Dominic and I have been trying to do for 2 years, and that is to get someone who knows what they're talking about, to talk about something that's very important to everybody, but also very confusing to a lot of people, and that's Social Security. So tonight we have Mike Lynch, Managing Director of Applied Insights at Hartford Funds. Hartford's been a great friend of ours, got us great speakers, And we're going to address tonight, David, all things pertaining to Social Security, all the questions you and I get every single day. When should I take it? How does it work? What happens if my spouse dies? What age should I do it? How is it taxed? We're hopefully going to address all those issues this evening.
Well, that sounds good to me. And I want you to know that I checked out a copy of Social Security for Dummies a couple of days ago just to bone up, because it is a very confusing subject and the questions never stop coming.
They never stop coming. So we will be right back with Michael Lynch, Managing Director of Applied Insights from Hartford Funds.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back this evening with my substitute co-host, David Walker, sitting in for Dominic Tavella, and our guest this evening, Mike Lynch from Hartford Funds. He's the Managing Director of Applied Insights. Good evening, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Michael. Thanks for having me. And David, nice to meet you. And again, thanks for the opportunity tonight.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us.
So, Mike, as I told you in the pre-show, I've been hoping to do this show literally for years. David emailed me, what kind of questions should I have? And I emailed him back at Social Security. It'll just be, we both have a million questions. It'll just be organic. And my first question that I get all the time is age 62, age full retirement, or age 70. That's the first question people always ask me. And my first response always is that the Social Security Department does not care. Like, they're actuarially neutral and there's really no right answer. So that's how I always start my answer. But I'll ask you, 62, full retirement, or age 70?
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. There's really no wrong answer. The problem is, too, there's no right answer, right? So there's no right or wrong. It would be easier if we just said, gosh, people that started at a certain year, you've got to wait till 65 or 67. But I think one of the positives with Social Security is the flexibility. One of the negatives is that flexibility. And I think it provides some confusion. So what we try and do is get people to take a step back, and instead of thinking about the word when, think about it as the word what. Instead of when should I file, think about what income do you need? And maybe even take a further step back and say, okay, as I enter or I'm thinking about retirement, overall, how much do I think I need from, it's just an income perspective. Of that, how much do I think I need from Social Security? And if we can kind of get to that what, we can almost backfill the when. So if you take, for example, somebody that's going to get $700 at 62, maybe $1,000 at age 67, full retirement age, or maybe $1,200, and I'm just making up numbers at 70. If they say, gosh, anything above 750, I'm in great shape. Well, we know that maybe we could think about filing a little earlier. If they say, I kind of need a little bit more, then maybe we need to kind of point towards that full retirement age. Or if they say, gosh, I really need a greater portion, then maybe we've got to think about 70. But we found it's been very effective at Hartford Funds for folks to really take a step back. And instead of thinking about it from a when perspective, kind of ask that question from a what perspective. What income are you looking for?
Some of the seminars I've done with people about such planning issues, I think what's interesting is that, first of all, that's exactly right. I mean, you have to, what do you really want? What do you need?
Right.
When do you need it? Those are very important questions before we ever get to that. And then I think also you run into all kinds of variations on the theme. As an example, I'm very close to somebody who, although in his early 60s, had a couple of kids, right? 2 teenage kids. Well, if you do the calculation and you have, children while you're accepting Social Security at an earlier age, it actually turns out to make more sense than it does to wait until you're 69 or 70, which surprised the heck out of him.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point. I think every situation is different. Just because a friend, a relative, or a neighbor chose an option or didn't choose an option, that might be right for you. It might be the exact wrong option. More often than not, honestly, I meet folks that are spouses. One spouse takes it early, generally the lower amount, and the other spouse that maybe has the higher income number or the higher benefit, they wait or try and wait. And I kind of call it dipping your toe into water. You take the smaller one first and see if that makes sense. if that's enough. If it is, the other one, maybe the bigger one, could continue to grow behind the scenes. If it doesn't, something changes, you need that money. And gosh, we all know life gets in the way, right? Sometimes the best laid plans, and then something happens or something changes. But I think really sitting down, and I think, to your point earlier, where you said, thinking about that book for dummies, I think the challenge, and I think one of the benefits really from Social Security is to talk to folks like yourselves. Talk to folks who know my spouse, know my kids, know what's important to me, what I'm looking for. And then we can come in with the best game plan, as opposed to, maybe just taking some generic information from offline, or I'm sorry, online, really having a conversation with folks.
Mike, I remember one conversation I had with a couple that was really eye-opening for them. And many people don't realize this until you have to verbalize it to them. I had a clients, they were basically the same age. They basically made the same income. And they said to me, we're both going to wait till we're age 70. And to your point, we make plans and God laughs. And I said to them, you both have been maxing out your Social Security your entire lives. If you wait to age 70, and God forbid one of you doesn't make it to age 70, you're going to lose all that money.
Right.
Because there's not going to be any spousal benefit. And I remember they both looked at each other, and as if, it was like a light bulb went off. They said, well, no one's actually explained that to me in that way. The other thing that I always look at when I try to answer this question is, are those benefits equal? Right. And how do those spousal survivor benefits work? Because I'd rather see someone take it early than lose it entirely, God forbid, if there's some event.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think one of the challenges, though, from a life expectancy perspective, and that's the biggest unknown. I mean, honestly, that's one of the biggest challenges with Social Security. It started in the mid 30s, right? So 1935. The average life expectancy at the time for a male was only 59. You didn't collect your benefit payment until 65. So you do the math, back then it was a great program for the government, not so much for, the person that died at 59, sadly. Where now we see people 80s, 90s, hundreds, relatively healthy and active, which loosely translates it to spending more money. So I don't want them to underestimate their life expectancy, but I certainly agree with you. I think that's one of the challenges. I always use myself as an example and say, ideally, I'd like to wait till 70. But what happens if I pass away at 69, right? I'm so excited. I got my fingers crossed. And then something happens at 69. I've lost out on that benefit from the age of 62 to 69. Now, the upside, and to your point earlier, what if there's a big difference from a life or from a benefit perspective? So say my wife is entitled to $500 a month. I waited, and now I'm entitled to $2,500 a month, but I pass away. Well, the good news is my wife gets that $2,500 or that death benefit. So not that there's a benefit to waiting in death, obviously, certainly a challenge, but there could be in certain situations. Again, that's kind of where you sit down and really kind of go through the pros and cons of each option, because there could potentially be that larger death benefit if I waited. If both of us turned it on at 62, something happened a few years later, she may have gotten a lower benefit.
So, David, I know it's your turn, but I just want to clarify one thing you said, Mike. It's the wife got 500, your wife got 500, you got 2,500, you pass away. Just to be clear, your wife's not getting 3,000. She's not getting her 500
right.
plus your 2,500. She's just getting your 2,500.
Right.
Right.
And that becomes, if you don't mind me,
No.
that becomes a huge issue. So coincidentally, I have an 84-year-old neighbor. We both met at the street because we were taking our trash out. I was trying to help her with her trash. And you can tell how boring my life is because we had a Social Security conversation in the road. She lost her husband about a year ago. So I was checking in just to make sure she's okay. She and her husband ran a business. They paid themselves the same amount, had the same amount of Social Security benefit, had downsized years ago down to one car, smaller type of location from a home. And the challenge is, as a family, they were getting $4,000 a month. Well, she lost him, unfortunately. She also got a pay cut. So as a family now, it's just her. She's down to $2,000 a month. But as we know, property tax didn't get cut in half. She's already down to one car, so it's still got to fill up the car, the gas, all these different types of things. Expenses on average, when you lose a spouse, only go down about 20%, not 50%. So it really does become a challenge in many situations.
A big challenge also when everything is much more expensive than it was even
Right.
2 or 3 years ago. And that's an interesting point to talk about from the standpoint of what are known as cost of living adjustments. Are they really that? I guess there's one coming up in the next year, 2024, that will be roughly 3.2%, something like that.
Right.
Not sure where they got that number, but things around here in the Denver metro area have been accelerating a little more than 3.2% a year lately. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about cost of living adjustments first and foremost. And I think, it's really rare that people understand that's not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been years, actually in 2009, 2010, there was a zero cost of living adjustment.
Right.
It started in 1975, and we've seen some highs, we've seen some lows, we've seen double digits. I think it was the late 80s or early 80s. I'm sorry. We saw 14, 11%. 2023 was about 8.7%. This year is expected 2024 to be about 3.2. But if you look at it on average between 75 and 2022, I think that works out to about 3.7. So it's not that far off on the average. So I kind of look at it both ways, I guess. I think, one, it's good news we're getting a cost of living adjustment, or people of that age are getting cost of living adjustment. My concern is that people see that lower number and say, okay, things must be much better, where, obviously going to the store, filling up your gas tank, things are certainly continue to be a challenge. And I think it also, we want to make sure they continue to do everything they can to outpace inflation, or at least keep up with inflation. And I think Social Security is one source of income, but they do need to think about their other sources of income, because those are the ones that hopefully I can work with you folks and outpace inflation or keep up with inflation. So it's an interesting time, and there's certainly been a lot of articles written recently about that cost of living adjustment, because it is, certainly a little bit lower, but it'll be interesting to see as we go forward how that's reflected, and to your point, how that's actually determined too.
Right. Well, Mike, it turns out again, Mike, that Mom was right, that you really should hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And the point is that 3 whatever percent, maybe in retrospect, has kept up, but should people expect it to keep up in the future? I would say with some skepticism, maybe.
Yeah, I think what we try and promote with folks is, even from day one, Social Security was never designed to be the sole source of income in retirement,
Right.
but rather a source.
Yeah.
Now, I do agree. I think our generation and future generations, I think of my dad. My dad unfortunately passed at 85, but I remember when he started his retirement, he started whistling out of the blue for no reason at all. And I'm thinking, why in the world are you so happy? And what I realized is he was entering retirement probably with more money than he had ever made while he was working. And he had partners with him. He had a strong pension and personal savings, in addition to Social Security. Now, I think our generation and future generations, pensions are a foreign term. So we're kind of going it alone. And that's where we really need to do everything we can. It's important to be educated about Social Security, but I think you also want to focus on those other sources of income, the IRAs, the Roth. Make sure you're doing everything you can. I do think the responsibility really for successful retirement is really being pushed off on us as individuals more and more, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Mike, let's do this. We're bumping up against a break. So when we come back, I want to ask you about the folks who take it at 62 and their accountant says, why'd you do that for? You're going to be penalized. But then you find out you're not really being penalized, because you're going to get that back later somehow, which is really super confusing even to us. And then I want to talk to you generally how Social Security is taxed in general.
Sounds great.
So we will be right back with Mike Lynch from Hartford Funds.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with my guest co-host tonight, David Walker, sitting in for Dominic Tavella again this week. And our guest this evening, Michael Lynch from Hartford Funds. Michael, we talked about people waiting. Let's talk about the folks who take it at 62 who are still working. And we always hear, well, if you take it early, you're still working, you're going to be penalized. But it's not necessarily a penalty, because Social Security will ultimately give you back that money. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. They call it withholding.
So how does that work? What's going on there?
So the idea behind it, and it's funny you say penalty, because I almost honestly think of it as a penalty. So what happens is when you turn 62, if you're currently working, so it would just be, say it was my wife and I, it would just be me they would look at. and if I was employed, or my wife, if she was taking her benefit and she was employed. So just our earned income. So if I choose to file early and I have a small, maybe I'm working a couple days a week and I'm making $20,000, then that's fine. My benefit is not reduced. But if I get above a certain amount, and in this case, this year, it's $21,240. So say I, do a good job and they add a couple hours on. If I literally make $21,242, they take $1 out of my check. If I earn another $2, they take $1 out of my check. So a quick rule of thumb is if you're making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year or more, and are going to continue to do that, and you're 62, 63 up until full retirement age, your benefit is dramatically reduced. So one of the examples I always use is somebody's making about $45,000. They're only above the cap by about $20,000, but they go from, say, $1,900 a month to $800 or $900 a month. I mean, that's a real eye opener. So technically, as to your point, that $800 or $900 a month is technically owed to me. It's my benefit. They just withhold it. The challenge is you don't get paid that back until you turn full retirement age, and they start paying you that back over your life expectancy. So as we spoke earlier about the concern of life expectancy and certainly the big unknown, what if I file early at 62, continue to work, and my check is really a lot lower than I thought? Once I reach full retirement age, I'm excited. Hey, I'm going to get a bigger check plus what I'm owed. And God forbid I have a heart attack or I get hit by a bus. I don't get that money back. That money was technically owed to me, and I don't get that money back. So that is really something where folks really need to sit down and say, is it sometime this year I'm going to retire? Am I going to slow down? Or am I just terrified of the Social Security company or organization? I just want to start taking my check. And I find that's more often than not what happens. People kind of have this run on the bank mentality. They think Social Security is going to go away altogether. So let me file, even if it's less, just let me file. If that helps you sleep at night, I certainly, won't condemn it. But I think people need to be aware of the fact that the check may be a little bit lower than what you thought you were going to get.
Well, and that is until the full retirement age of 66. Is that correct?
Yeah, or 67, depend. Yeah, so
Right.
it'll roll up to 67 or 66
Right.
in 3 months. Correct.
Yeah.
And then after that, so if I retired at 67, sat on the couch and said, hey, I can't wait, it's great retirement. 2 months later, I'm still on the couch and my wife is pushing me off the couch saying, go back to work. I can earn $1 at that point. I can earn $10 million. It does not matter. My benefit's not reduced. I'm probably going to pay taxes and continue to pay taxes. But benefit reduction is only prior to full retirement age. And again, just solely on my earned income or maybe my spouse's earned income as she files.
And Michael, of course, rather than one, we would really encourage people to make the 10 million, wouldn't we?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think so.
Okay.
But it is an interesting thing to think about. And I think one of the ways I always think about Social Security is there's really two groups. Prior to full retirement age, if I choose to do something, sometimes I don't have as much flexibility. Not to say it's right or wrong. I don't give tax or legal advice, but it does pigeonhole you sometimes into different situations. If I can wait until full retirement age or older, sometimes I have more flexibility. And, again, I've done face-to-face seminars. People say, that's great. I'm filing at 62. Terrific. We paid into the program. We're entitled to it. We just want to make sure people know what their options are. But that is a big concern. And a lot of folks, honestly, have not realized that benefit, we'll get calls saying, gosh, it's a lot less than we talked about. Well, it's probably because you're going to continue to work or are expecting to continue to work.
So, David, by the way, I think you may have moved your mic. We had a hard time hearing you in the last two questions. So to your point, people could go on Social Security, is at ss.gov, and they could get a complete rundown, because the government doesn't send that report every year like they used to. They send it every 5 years, and then when you're eligible, correct?
Yeah, so we encourage people to go to ssa.gov.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, it's the go-to resource. I go out there constantly. Actually, before this call, I went out there. If there's any negative, honestly, I think it's as if they put too much information out there. So I encourage people, use the search bar, type in your question. I guarantee you'll get information. You may not fully understand it, and I don't either sometimes, but you'll get the information. So what they want us to do is go to ssa.gov, set up an account. It'll allow us to run a quick calculation, tell us approximately what we're entitled to. It'll tell us our full retirement age. what we're entitled to at 62. And then I always recommend, if folks have just an extra, 30 seconds, just go out and check your sources of income just to make sure it's accurate. Now, certainly do it with a grain of salt. I went out there not too long ago and it had money when I was 15 years of age, which I always thought was interesting because legally you can't contribute till you're 16 or work till you're 16. But I guess I snuck in at 15. There was money that I contributed to Social Security. I don't know if that $800 was correct or not, but I'm more focused on the past 10 or 15 years. Is that information correct? And I think majority of people out there, it is, but it's just worth having the to just confirm that.
And Mike, one other point, just about premature collection of Social Security. If you get laid off, you could collect, and then if 9 months from now you get a job again, you could stop it. Right? These are not irrevocable elections, correct?
Well, they are. Unfortunately, now there is a time frame involved. So years ago, you could file at 62. People would honestly file at 62, maybe take that benefit, see if they needed it. If they didn't, maybe turn around and invest it with you. Maybe at 67, they've got this nest egg of money. They could actually pay themselves back, turn it off, pay themselves back, and then restart it. Now you're able to do that, but you only have within the first 12 months. So if I want to change my mind, it's within the first 12 months. And gosh, I caution people all the time, the older I get, certainly the quicker these months are flying. I mean, it's going to be Thanksgiving in a couple of weeks, right? So I think if you're choosing to do that or you're on the fence about that, no, it's 12 months. 12 months and 18 months are not right next to each other. There's a big difference, or 2 years. So just know that if you choose to do it 13, 14, 15 months later, something changes. Unfortunately, you're past that point. You can contact Social Security, but I'm not sure how much flexibility they'll be able to provide you.
Okay.
Well, with the point of reference being changes, one thing that I run into, and again, in some of the presentations I make, is that there's palpable fear among people. And I hope my mic's working better now, Mike. Thank you for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. But there's a lot of concern about, will Social Security be there in the future? And how much will it be cut if it's changed? And how soon are those changes going to take place relative to the debt that we're incurring seemingly more and more rapidly as every day goes by?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I certainly don't have a crystal ball, but our position at Hartford Funds is we don't think the program's going to go away altogether. We think it's too important a social program. Now, with that said, let me clearly clarify, we don't think it's going to stay exactly the same as it is today. I mean, as I mentioned, the program's, started in 1935, so it's 80 plus years of age. I'd argue if you know anybody in their 80s, they probably have changed a little bit over the years. Same thing with Social Security. We'll probably continue to see changes. We just don't know what those changes look like at this point. We've seen some full retirement age gradually being pushed up from 65 to 67. That was an idea to try and, continue to have that continue to grow and be out there. But I'm hard pressed to envision, with the election cycle, I'm certainly starting to think about it, but I'm hard pressed to see someone saying at a podium or standing at a podium saying, by the way, on my watch, Social Security ended. But with that said, they could certainly come in tomorrow or next week and say, okay, benefits are capped, or the contribution limit of 166, I guess, next year. Well, that's being taken away. It's, $1 million, 10 million, whatever the number is. So there are changes that could be made to hopefully continue to allow Social Security to be there. It's just what those changes look like and how they're implemented down the road. And again, getting our elected leaders to get together. And, I think one of the last election cycles, they talked about Social Security and kicking the can down the street. And no pun intended, but we're kind of at the cul-de-sac at this point. We've got to do something, and they've got to do something. And again, whether it is sweeping reform or drips and drabs, and that's where, we always encourage people, think about things you can control. Social Security changes, you really don't have much control over that, but I do have control over my 401k, my IRA, and other types of investments. So I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to shore up my retirement. And then if there are changes, I went ahead and planned for those. If there's no changes, great news. I'll hopefully get a little more money in retirement. But if there are changes, that's what we work so hard to prepare for.
Mike, since we're talking about politics, under the second George Bush administration, the son, he was pretty adamant about giving Social Security participants the ability to invest their money in the S&P 500 or the bond market. And on the surface, because I guess we do this for a living, it didn't sound like a terrible idea, right? But it died. It kind of died on the vine. It got completely shot down. Do you ever see a time where people are actually empowered to take control, literally take control over their own Social Security benefit?
Yeah, I mean, this is more personal speaking than Hartford Funds,
Yep.
but I think I'd like to see it. I have a hard time envisioning it. I also think of like the My IRA. Remember, the government kind of stepped in and said, "Hey, here's a program. We're going to make you invest in your own retirement." And honestly, I don't even know where it's at this point. I don't even know if anybody elected to do it. So I do think it has some merit, and I do think it does have an opportunity, but I also get concerned about people that maybe aren't seeking the counsel of a qualified person. That's where we at Hartford Funds, we're big fans of building a team, having yourselves, having a tax professional, legal professional, and really, again, thinking about me as an individual. But I do think there's some appeal to it, but I just don't know what type of traction it'll gather. And again, it's one of those things we've got to get both sides together to talk about it. And that's really where we're laxing, I guess, at this point, is just getting both sides of the group to talk and at least begin to have the conversation. And again, with that said, for all I know, there could be something behind the scenes that they're working on right now, and I hope they are. But
they're not.
Yeah, probably not. That's my glimmer of hope for the night, but I shut down quickly.
I'm going to be Lucy this time. They're not.
I didn't know you were that wired in, Michael, but I'm glad to hear it.
That's great. Well, then we're done. Unfortunately.
Well, the fact is, in a recent debate, there was only one candidate who was even willing to talk about it. Now he's out of the race, so that'll teach him.
Yeah, and Christie last time, when you think about not this, but when Trump was initially running, Chris Christie was the only one that talked about it, and he was out right away. So sadly, I don't know if that was a direct correlation or not, but yeah, it's such an important program. But again, I think, what keeps me up at night is my IRA, not Social Security, because I don't have any control over it. I can think about different options, and I've got great people like you that I can kind of bounce ideas off of. But where I really need to focus my time and attention is that personal savings side of it.
Well, and having an actual plan and having a detailed plan that you have committed to, and all of that is so important. And it's just interesting how many people I run into who have no plan, who are just hoping. The hope is not a strategy, right? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's exactly it. I think I think what you folks bring to the table too is you've got other clients that are in their 60s, 70s, 80s that have chose different options. So not that you're going to disclose, private information, but you can also kind of say, okay, gosh, Mike, I know people like you and your wife, Kim, here's their situation. Here's why they chose what they chose. Again, it might be the right thing for you. It might be the wrong thing for you. But I always like trying to bounce ideas off of people that have actually taken it. If you had to do it over again, what would you do differently? Were you thrilled with it? Were you upset? Did it really meet your expectations? I always use my in-laws as an example because they're 82 and 20 years ago, they took their Social Security. And I think, honestly, they were at that group that really were concerned that it was going to go away. And I don't think they needed it. And now it certainly hasn't kept up with where they want to be because they took it. Anytime you take it early at 62, one of the things we talked about, but you take a big haircut, it's probably 75 cents on the dollar. So you're already starting kind of, even the Charlie Brown analogy, you're starting way off the football field to some extent. So I think that's something people really need to think about as well.
So speaking of, when to take it and when not to take it, could we talk a little bit about how Medicare and the payment for Medicare gets tied into this? Because I think you become Medicare eligible at 66, but in my particular case, I'm going to be full retirement age at 67. So that's number one. And number two, forgetting prematurely, but at 67, how is Social Security taxed, Mike? And how do they take the Medicare payment?
Sure. And again, I really don't do much on the Medicare side, but I do know I think we saw a bulk of people probably filing at 65, because if you didn't file at 65,
65, not 66. Yeah.
you got this Medicare bill, right? So you're like, gosh, I don't want a bill. By the way, if we file for Social Security, we can withhold that money and it can pay for your Medicare. So I think that was, and I think that continues to drive some people saying, I just don't want that extra bill. It'd be so much easier if I filed. It might not be the right option for them, or it might help them sleep at night. But again, I think it's something they need to think about. Now, excuse me, from a Social Security taxation perspective, what they do is they take a look at your modified adjusted gross income. So we talked about benefit reduction earlier and withdrawals. That was just earned income. Now it's modified adjusted gross. It's my wife, Kim, and I are combined because we do married filing jointly. So that number is probably a little bit bigger. They take a look at that. And then unfortunately, they add in half your Social Security benefit. So if I was making, say, $30,000 a year and I filed for my Social Security benefit and it was $2,000, I'm just making up numbers, $2,000 a month, that's $24,000 a year. Half of that, $12,000, is then added into that modified adjusted gross income number, and that becomes your provisional income, or your bottom line number. And then there are some factors that they look at. So if that number equals, say, 30 plus thousand, we're probably going to pay taxes on up to half of our Social Security benefit. So the way the range work, if you're below $25,000, so say, you're talking to somebody in retirement, all they're taking is a Social Security benefit, then they're probably not going to pay taxes on their Social Security. But if they're above 25,000 or 32,000 married filing jointly, up to about, what is it? Sorry, I wrote it down. 42,000, I believe, or 34,000. So if you're single, 25 to 34,000, you're going to pay taxes on up to half of your Social Security benefit. Married filing jointly, it's 32,000 to 44,000. And again, you'll pay taxes up to 50%. And then if it's $34,000 for single, $44,000 married filing jointly, you're going to pay taxes on up to 85% of it. So if you're $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, you're going to pay taxes on more than 3/4 of it.
One other follow-up question. This is the question I think David and I and Dominic and all our advisors get all of the time. The break even between waiting between 67 and 70, right? You're getting 36 months worth of payment, right?
Right.
So there's a break even. There's a number of way above 70 where you'll be now ahead of the game by waiting. I know that number is always different for each person, but is it 78? Is it 80? Is there an average number that most people could count on? If they waited, this is how long they have to live to kind of beat the system?
Sure. And it won't make it nearly as complicated as the taxation. I apologize.
Right. So you're good.
There is this break-even analysis, and it's generally late 70s. So 78, 79 years of age. So if my assumption is I'm going to pass away at, say, 75 or 76, I'm probably better off filing at 62, collecting those benefits throughout that whole time. If, again, I've got relatives and my assumption is I'm going to live 80s, 90s, if not hundreds, then I'm probably better off waiting until full retirement age. If not, maybe 70 if I can wait, because I'll get that greater amount for a greater period of time. Two biggest unknowns, right? One is life expectancy, which is something we can't predict. But then two, the one question you have to think about as well, when we talked about that withholding, is am I going to continue to work or not at 62? So, I've met folks that have said, I kind of did the break-even analysis and I think I'm better off maybe filing early. So the question I have is, are you going to stop working at 62? And usually the response I get is, heavens no, I'm going to continue to work as long as I can. Well, you have to really use that number. As we mentioned earlier, if say you're entitled to $1,000 a month, but you're above that cap so much, you might get a couple $100 a month. Now you have to use the break even on that couple $100 a month, not that $1,000, because you weren't receiving it. So not to overcomplicate it, but that's one of the biggest things you really need to think about: life expectancy. And then am I going to stop working? If somebody says 62, I'm done, then we can use that late 70s as a good analogy to kind of think about would it make sense to file early. But if they say, gosh, I'm going to work another 5 years, we've got to kind of tweak those numbers a little bit. And that's going to push off that break even a little farther.
Well, speaking of life expectancy, didn't we run into a bit of a brick wall here a couple of years back where it actually started to go back down a bit? And is that a factor at all in terms of making any kind of accurate prediction, given technology and given advancement in the medical field? Or is that something you really shouldn't worry too much about?
No, I do think it's something you need to think about because, again, I think we still underestimate our life expectancy. We still compare our life expectancy to our parents or grandparents.
Right.
So we at Hartford Funds, we have a unique relationship with MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and specifically the little school up there in Cambridge, right?
Yeah, they're not bad. They're pretty smart guys.
Yeah, they're rocket scientists, some of them. And literally, we work with one of the best rocket scientists, this guy named, a gentleman named Dr. Joe Coughlin. He runs an area called the Age Lab. And we at Hartford Funds are this founding sponsor of MIT's Age Lab. And what they do is they study all aspects of aging, thinking about housing, transportation, healthcare, whatever the discipline. Dr. Joe and his team are on top of it doing the research. And one of the things they always remind us of is there are two separate set of life expectancy tables. One that takes into account infant mortality, things that happen in our 20s, 30s, and so on. But there's a separate set of life expectancy tables that kicks in, especially for a husband and wife at the age of 65. And it's a whole separate set. And basically what it says is if a husband and wife reach age 65, there's a terrific chance that one of them, 50% in fact, is going to reach 90 plus. So we have seen life expectancy as a whole decrease over the last couple of years. We're starting to see that climb back up. But again, I think it's one of those things, I think of my dad and mom, right? And as a kid driving a station wagon, seatbelts were a foreign term. It was my mother's right arm, right? That was the seatbelt. And hopefully she could reach across, right? Smoking while you were working,
Sure.
Asbestos in the homes and, lead paint. It's amazing we're even on the call now that we lived as long as we did. Or now, to your point, the advancements in medicine and technology just continue to, what was maybe a serious operation is now more of an outpatient type of thing where, it's maybe more therapeutic and taking some medicine for maybe a little longer period of time. So that's, I think, one of the biggest takeaways is don't underestimate life expectancy. It's one of the biggest unknowns, but for some reason we continue to compare that to prior generations.
Well, I'll make a quick point, Mike, which is that I'm going to attend a service on Friday for a gentleman who lived to be 97. He's the father of one of my best friends from high school.
Wow.
And I know he was a planner, but that means he's a good example of how we must plan and assume, I think, the best, not the worst.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, you think about that living to 92 or 95, one of the things Dr. Joe will remind us is the bulk of that, you're going to be living relatively healthy and active, which again, I think of my grandparents' generation, maybe retired at 65, passed away at 70 or 72, where now it's 82, if not 92. And the bulk of that time, that 20-year time frame, I'm spending money, right? Visiting the grandkids. I'm doing hobbies and pickleball and, all these different types of activities. That's, again, you're going to be spending money. So this generation is going to turn retirement on its ear. It's unlike any prior generation. So it's part of the challenge, but it's part of the good news, but it's also part of the challenge from a planning perspective.
Guys, we are just about out of time. Mike, can't thank you enough. And I also appreciate you bringing up the folks at MIT and the Age Lab. We've had them on the podcast. Dominic and I have met them several times. And my two favorite questions are, who am I going to go for ice cream with and who's going to change my light bulbs?
That's great. That's great to hear. I can't thank you both enough for the opportunity tonight. I appreciate it. Yeah, MIT's been a great partner of ours, so we're truly blessed to have them. And again, thank you both for the time tonight. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for sitting in for Dom. And God willing, Dominic and I will be back next week with a new edition of the Lebenthal Report. Have a good night, everybody.